Hello, my name is Arik Korman, Communications Director with League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series over 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today we will hear from Allison Rose Sokol, Assistant Director of P12 Policy at the Education Trust, and Natasha Ushomirsky, Director of P12 Policy Development, also at the Education Trust, on how Washington State's student outcomes and teacher workforce composition compares with other states. Allison and Natasha will speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function on your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us at info@educationvoters.org. As Assistant Director of P12 Policy, Allison Rose Sokol develops and conducts data and policy analyses related to trends in student achievement and achievement gaps, accountability, school and district improvement, college and career readiness for all students, and school funding. Allison also helps to develop recommendations for federal and state policy. Before joining EdTrust, Allison was a research institute at the Center for Scaling Up Effective Schools, which focuses on identifying the programs, practices, and policies that make high schools in large urban districts particularly effective for low-income students and students of color. She had the opportunity to work as a research intern at the University of North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, where she focused on students' access to strong teachers, beginning teacher retention, and assessment policy. She also worked as a literary coach to kindergarten and first grade teachers in rural North Carolina schools, and taught for 3 years at Elsie Whitlow Stokes Community Freedom Public Charter School in Washington, D.C. She earned her teaching certification through the Inspired Teaching Certification Program. Allison is a doctoral student in education policy, leadership, and school improvement at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She holds a master's degree in teaching from Trinity University and a bachelor's degree in public policy from UNC. Natasha Ushomirsky leads development of EdTrust's policy agenda on issues critical to promoting equity and achievement in the P12 system, including standards, assessments, accountability, educator quality, and funding fairness. She previously served as the organization's senior data and policy analyst, where she focused on using data to better understand the gaps in opportunity and achievement in our education system. Natasha joined the Education Trust after completing her master's in education policy and management at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before graduate school, she spent 3 years at Apt Associates, a research and consulting firm where she worked on a variety of research and analysis projects, including economic analyses of environmental regulations and market studies. She holds a bachelor's in economics and Spanish language and literature from Brandeis University. Please welcome Allison Rose Sokol and Natasha Ushomirsky.
Thank you, Arik. It's great to be with you all this afternoon. This is Allison, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the state of opportunity and achievement in Washington. Before we jump right into the content, a little bit about who the Education Trust is. So we're a nonprofit advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We promote high academic achievement for all students at all levels with a particular focus on low-income children and children of color. We do this a variety of ways, including conducting research and policy analysis on patterns and practices that cause and can close gaps in opportunity and achievement, through advocacy, pushing for policies and practices that help to close those gaps, and by providing technical assistance to folks in districts, states, and community-based organizations. So we'll jump right in. Washington Public Schools educate over 1 million students. Let's take a quick look at the demographics in Washington. You'll see that nearly 1 in 5 students in Washington is Latino, and about half are from low-income families. Compared to national averages, Washington has lower percentages of students from low-income families and children living in poverty. And you'll see there's been an increase in the percentage of English learners in your state from about 7% in 2004 to about 10% in 2014, which is slightly higher than the national average. So we can see which students attend public schools in your state. The big question is about how your schools are performing for those students, both overall and for each student group. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you a lot of data. I'm not going to show you data on Washington's state tests. Instead, we're going to look at data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. NAEP is a test that's given every 2 years to a sample of kids in every state, and it's really useful because it allows us to compare how students in different states are doing. So first, let's take a look at NAEP scores for 4th grade reading in Washington. You'll see that this chart shows the percentage of kids overall and for each group who performed at different levels. So the green is proficient or advanced, the yellow is basic or not yet proficient, and that red color represents what's called below basic, where we really don't want any students to be. You can see that about 40% of all students in Washington scored proficient or higher in reading, and about 30% were in that below basic or red category. But when you look across at the results for student groups, for Black students, for Latino students, for Native students, you can see that there are far fewer kids in that green proficient or advanced category, and many, many more in that red below basic category. When we take a look across income levels, you can see that while nearly 60% of higher income 4th graders in Washington were on grade level in reading, the state has far lower results for low income kids. Only about a quarter of low income students were on grade level. And you can see that nearly half were in that below basic, the red category. You can see similar disparities when we look at the results for English learners and for students with disabilities. We can also look at how Washington has been doing over time. You don't need to worry too much about those numbers. The thing to really pay attention to is the lines and where they're going. So you can see that the results for all students are that gray bar. The results for Black students are represented by the yellow bar, for Latino students, the light blue bar. And you can see that the results for Black and Latino students have been mostly flat in the last decade, and that the lines that are going up, the red and purple lines, represent gains for white and Asian students. And so what's happening is that Washington schools have large disparities in achievement between groups that are actually widening rather than narrowing over time. Let's take a look at how Washington's results compare to other states and to the national average. In the next few slides, you're going to see charts like this one, which shows the results in 4th grade reading on NAEP for each state. So you'll see that Washington is colored in red, so you can see it easily, and then the national average is in light gray. There's some pretty good news here, which is that Washington's overall results in 4th grade reading are above the national average. When we look at the results for Black students, there's some good news, and then there's some pretty bad news. So the bad news is that for all states, the bars just dropped pretty significantly. The good news is that Washington is doing better than many, if not most, other states for Black students. But when we look at how Washington is doing for Latino students, for Latino 4th grade students in reading, you can see that Washington is below the national average and actually in the bottom quarter of states. And for low-income students, Washington is somewhere in the middle of the pack, very close to the national average. It can be helpful not just to look at how your state is doing right now compared to other states, but also to look at how your state's been improving over time compared to other states. I know this graph is a little bit tricky, but it has some really important and interesting information. So each dot on this graph represents a state. The red dot is Washington, and the green lines represent the national averages. So the dots that are higher up are states that have higher than average performance. And the dots that are further to the right are states that are improving more quickly on average. So you can see that while Washington is closer to the top than many other states, meaning that you have higher than average performance, your improvement is about average compared to other states. And when we look at results for Latino students, you can see that Latino students in Washington are scoring below the national average, and that the state has made very little improvement for Latino students over the last decade or so. Let's take a few minutes to look now at, we're still looking at NAEP scores, but now we're going to take a look at 8th grade math. You can see that of all students, about 4 in 10 students in Washington, 8th grade students, scored proficient or higher in math, but that the state is showing far lower results for African American and Latino students. So you can see that about 1 in 10 African American students and about 2 in 10 were on grade level, compared to that 40% of all students. And we see similar disparities for low-income students, English learners, and students with disabilities. Again, this is a trend line, so we're looking over time, and you can see that much like when we were looking at the 4th grade reading results, that results for most groups of students have been flat, and in some cases even decreasing over time, and that Washington schools continue to have these wide disparities in achievement that are actually growing. So we can take a look at how Washington's results in 8th grade math compare to other states. When we look overall, like we did for 4th grade reading, you can see that Washington's overall results are above the national average. But when we look for low-income students, you can see that those bars dropped pretty dramatically, although Washington is doing better for low-income kids than many other states. But the results for Latino students and for Black students are below the national average. Let's take another quick look at Washington's performance and improvement compared to other states, again with 8th grade math. So that red dot is Washington. Since you can see that it's higher than most, showing that Washington has higher than average overall performance in 8th grade math, but that Washington has about average improvement in the last decade compared to other states. And compared to how other states are doing for Latino students, Washington has about average performance, but much slower than average improvement compared to other states. I want to take a minute to show you some SAT results. You know, research shows that SAT scores are a really good indication of students' readiness for success in college and career. When we look at which students are meeting college-ready benchmarks on the SATs, we see that about half of Washington students meet those benchmarks. But when we look at the results for Black, Latino, and Native students, we see results that are much lower. And when we look at whether students are graduating on time, we see that the state's overall graduation rate for all students is 78%. But when you look across individual student groups, you see much lower graduation rates. So for example, for low-income students, it's only 68%. When we look at Washington's graduation rate as compared to the graduation rate in other states, you can see that Washington's grad rate is below the national average, and that the grad rate for low-income students is also below the national average. The same is true for Latino students. So I just showed you a lot of data about disparities in achievement. And what we know is that those disparities are a direct result of gaps in opportunity. And so I want to take a few minutes to talk about what we know about differences in opportunity to learn and opportunity to succeed in schools in Washington. Let's start by talking a little bit about funding. So the highest poverty and lowest poverty districts in Washington receive more or less similar amounts of state and local funding per student. And when we compare that funding across states, we see that Washington's allocating funding less progressively than many other states. So there's a lot of information, I know, going on in this graph. The green bars represent states that are providing at least 5% more in state and local funding to their highest poverty districts than their lowest poverty districts. And those red states are ones that are providing more funding to their lowest poverty districts. And so you can see that Washington is allocating funding a little bit less progressively than those green states. In addition to this less progressive funding, we also see that low-income students and students of color in the state also have less access to critical resources and critical learning opportunities than their white or higher-income peers, including, for example, less access to early learning opportunities. So we see that children from low-income families in Washington are far less likely to be enrolled in preschool, while about half of students from higher income families are in pre-K, only about 30% of students from low-income families are. And we even see that enrollment for 3- and 4-year-olds in early education from both low-income and high-income families in Washington is actually below the national average. We also see that in Washington, low-income students and students of color have less access to rigorous courses. So low-income students in Washington are far less likely to be enrolled in higher-level math in 8th grade than their higher-income peers. And we see similar disparities, in this case, percent of students taking algebra or higher in 8th grade. We see those similar disparities for English learners and students with disabilities. Similarly, Black and Latino students are underrepresented in the population of students taking advanced placement exams. So while nearly 20% of students in Washington are Latino, Latino students represent only 13% of the advanced placement test takers in the state. We also see that low-income students and students of color have less access to strong teachers and to teachers who look like them. We know that teachers make a huge difference for kids. There is no perfect way to measure excellent teaching, but no matter which indicator we look at, we see the same trend. Students of color and low-income kids are less likely to have access to a strong, diverse, and consistent workforce. So, for example, when we're looking at who is assigned to those first-year inexperienced teachers, we see that Black and Native students are much more likely to be taught by those first-year teachers, and we know that no matter how good a teacher is or is going to become, that first year is really rough. I know that it was in my first year as a classroom teacher. And we see that low-income students and students of color are also more likely to be assigned to the least effective teachers. In fact, low-income students in Washington are nearly twice as likely to be assigned to the least effective teachers as their higher income peers. We also see that Washington's teacher workforce is much whiter than the student body it serves. So while 20% of students in Washington are Latino, Latino teachers make up just less than 4% of the teacher workforce. The one thing we see that low-income students and students of color get is harsh exclusionary discipline practices. So in Washington, students of color are much more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white peers. And we see that low-income students and students with disabilities are also disproportionately suspended or expelled. So I just showed you a lot of data about disparities in opportunity and gaps in achievement. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, what can we do about it? What are my key areas for action? And there are many. This is not a comprehensive list, but a few of those key areas for action include pushing for transparent information, so disaggregated data by student group about access to resources, access to learning opportunities, and outcomes, meaning that any time that states and districts are presenting information, it should be by student groups so that those gaps in opportunity, those gaps in achievement are visible. Another key area for action is pushing your education leaders to set really high expectations for all students and for each group of students, and to make sure that there's immediate action and support when schools or districts aren't meeting those expectations. A third key area for action is pushing for additional resources for the highest poverty districts and districts serving the most students of color. And finally, advocating for expanded access to those opportunities to learn and succeed that we talked about, especially for low-income children and children of color. So things like access to high-quality early learning, access to rigorous courses that lead students to be ready for college and career, access to a strong and diverse teacher workforce, and fair discipline policies that don't disproportionately target students of color or low-income kids. I'm going to open it up to questions, and Natasha and I are happy to chat.
All right, well, thank you, Allison and Natasha. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, just type your question in the Q&A feature on your screen. No question is too basic. So one question that I've already got is, on the comparison slides, what is DODEA? It looked like one of the first or items near the top, and I couldn't tell, is that a state or is that something else?
That stands for Department of Defense schools. So those are schools that are operated by the Department of Defense. Sorry about that. We should have clarified that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thank you, Natasha, for that, because I noticed that the results were quite good.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, they are pretty strikingly good, and I think that's been fairly consistent on NAEP. It was interesting. We were just reading a few articles, kind of proposing some different possibilities of what might contribute to that. You know, as per usual, it's really hard, unfortunately, with NAEP to say that any sort of one thing is leading to an outcome that we see.
Got it. Great. Well, I have a question here, which is, shouldn't we be concerned that the national average is so low? Are we dropping in terms of global comparison?
Yes, we should absolutely be concerned that the national averages are so low, and most certainly, you know, I think benchmarking against top performing states or against national averages can be a helpful tool to get a sense of sort of how schools in a particular state are doing, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all. As you saw, for example, as Allison pointed out, when we went from looking at results for all students to looking at results for individual groups of students, you saw that dramatic drop in the height of the bars across the board for all states. And that means that, frankly, no matter how high performing as compared to other states your state is, frankly, everybody's got more work to do when it comes to improving outcomes for low-income kids and kids of color.
So true. Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question here. You show that Washington is in the bottom left quadrant for Latino student proficiency over time, but which states are showing stronger progress in this area? And are there particular policies or practices that match that progress?
So as per, as I just mentioned, it's really hard to sort of give a reason of why, kind of especially based on NAEP data. Certainly, in terms of which states are up in that top quadrant, we'd love to be able to follow up with you by email if it's possible to get contact information. I would like to, we actually have a tool on the EdTrust website that lets you look at the names of the states, and we just included some screenshots from that tool here. So rather than us trying to pull that up and spend time on that right now, be happy to follow up with you kind of offline.
Great. So what we'll do is we'll post the slide deck so that anyone attending can see that. And then if you could send me that link, I'll include that in the previous LEVinar section of our website at educationvoters.org.
Happy to.
Great. I have another question here, which is, do you also have college completion and college remediation data that you can share?
Our higher education team certainly does. So we can, I'm actually not 100% sure on remediation information. That data, I believe, is not available by state from national sources. We would have to take a look and see whether Washington makes that information available. In terms of graduation rates, that is certainly something that we can follow up with.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. What does research say about how much more money should be directed to high poverty schools in comparison to low poverty schools?
That is such a great question. And the reason I say that it's a great question is because the estimates are somewhat all over the place. And there's not a single sort of very clear answer. Now, when we did the analysis of looking at funding equity, one of the things that we did was make an assumption that it costs 40% more to estimate a child in poverty than a child who is not in poverty. That estimate is based, frankly, on federal law. The 40% amount is built into the Title I funding formula that's part of the Every Student Succeeds Act and its predecessors. We tried to kind of get a sense of whether that was a good estimate or not by doing a whole literature review, and to be honest, the numbers we were seeing went from a lot lower than that to a whole lot higher. So this seemed like a reasonable kind of midpoint estimate to go with. That said, I don't think that the research has a clear answer, especially when you consider that while the amount of funding very much matters, the way that money is used matters greatly as well. And we do know that while we absolutely need to be directing more funding to our highest poverty districts and schools, we also have to make sure that that money is being used efficiently and that it's accompanied by high expectations for the results and improvement for all groups of kids.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. All right, we have time for just about one more question. And I got this one, which I think will open up at least a few streams of thought. The key areas of action are helpful, but it would also be great to hear about other states that have some exemplar practices that match these key areas. We usually look to Massachusetts as the golden child. What are other examples out there for us to look at as models?
Well, I'll let Natasha handle the answer to the Massachusetts question, but I'll say that that's another thing we'd love to follow up with you on, because there's no state that's doing everything right. And there are certainly states that are exemplars in individual areas that are doing really promising things, expanding access to early childhood, making data about access to strong teachers more readily available. And we would love to follow up and share that with folks.
Yep, I think that's right. I think there are definitely pieces and kind of positive examples to point to in each of these areas. For example, Tennessee is just working on putting in place a school accountability system that pays substantial attention to the results of historically underserved students, and is hoping to use that accountability system to prompt improvement on behalf of kids who frankly have been underserved for a really long time. That state is also doing some interesting things around looking at teacher data and trying to pinpoint the sources of disparities in access to strong teachers and kind of developing action steps based on that data analysis. Massachusetts is also being really thoughtful about looking at information on which kids are getting access to which teachers. There are some states that are far more progressive when it comes to funding schools than others, as you saw in that chart. And obviously each state's context is a little bit different, but there may be some things to learn from in terms of how the funding systems in those states are structured. So bits and pieces in different places, but you know, as you can see with those national averages and even with state level results, and again, those drops in results from the overall data to individual groups of kids, everyone's got more work to do in some area.
They certainly do. Just one quick question about that. We looked at the slide saying that only 30% of low-income students in Washington are enrolled in preschool. Are there any states where a majority of low-income students are enrolled in pre-K?
Let us follow. There certainly are districts. There are far more districts now moving toward universal pre-K enrollment and greatly expanding those opportunities. I am not sure which states, who's gone statewide with those initiatives, and frankly, there may be an argument for starting with the highest need districts first.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much for a great presentation, Allison and Natasha. Our next webinar on changes in education funding as related to the McCleary case will take place next month, with the exact date to be determined. Our registration information will soon be on our website, educationvoters.org. And thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions, please send them to info@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation and the slide deck will be available on our website, educationvoters.org, along with the link to the Education Trust website that will let us dig into the data a little bit more. Please feel free to share this information with your friends and your colleagues. Thank you again for attending. We hope you will join us at future webinars. And once again, Allison and Natasha, thank you so much.
It's our pleasure.